Imagine, if you will, living in a world where every single word, even a whispered comment to a friend, is meticulously recorded and analyzed.
Right, and where simply disagreeing with the government, even voicing a minor complaint, could utterly ruin your life.
Or even worse, where just the desire to leave your country, to seek a different life elsewhere, could land you in a secret prison, subject to unimaginable psychological torture.
That was the chilling reality for millions of people living in East Germany under the constant and suffocating watch of the Stasi.
The Stasi, or Ministry for State Security, was this incredibly pervasive and powerful secret police force that controlled nearly every aspect of life in East Germany from 1945 until the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989.
It's a truly dark and fascinating chapter in history, and today we're going to dive deep into the inner workings of the Stasi state, exploring the human cost of such absolute control and the remarkable resilience of those who dared to resist.
I'm always blown away by stories of people who lived through these kinds of regimes. It really makes you appreciate the freedoms we often take for granted.
Absolutely. The material you shared for this deep dive is truly incredible. We have firsthand accounts from people who lived under the Stasi's constant scrutiny, alongside really insightful historical analysis.
So we're going to unpack all of this, exploring not just the dry facts and figures, but also the nuances of what it really meant to live in a society where your every move was watched, your every word potentially twisted and used against you.
Our aim today is to really understand the sheer scale and reach of the Stasi's power, how they built and maintained this vast network of surveillance, and the profound and lasting impact it had on individuals and families.
Okay, so let's jump right in. Where do we even begin with something as massive and complex as the Stasi?
Well, I think it's crucial to grasp the sheer scale of their operation right from the start. East Germany, the German Democratic Republic as they called it, was a relatively small country with a population of roughly 17 million people.
But within this seemingly ordinary nation, the Stasi had built a security apparatus that was arguably more extensive and intrusive than anything seen even in the Soviet Union, which was, the ideological heart of the communist bloc.
Absolutely. The Stasi had nearly 100,000 official employees, full-time agents dedicated to maintaining state security, which is a huge number when you consider the size of the country.
But here's the truly chilling part. In addition to these official agents, they had this vast network of informers, ordinary citizens, recruited, coerced, or sometimes even blackmailed into spying on their friends, neighbors, colleagues, even their own family members.
Some estimates suggest that if you include these unofficial informants, part-time or occasional collaborators, there was potentially one Stasi informant for every 6.5 citizens in East Germany.
That's just mind-boggling. Imagine living in a society where you can't even trust your closest friends or family because they might be reporting your every word and action to the secret police.
That's precisely the kind of atmosphere the Stasi aimed to create, a climate of pervasive fear, suspicion, and ultimately self-censorship, where people would constantly second-guess themselves, afraid to express any opinion or take any action that might deviate from the rigid norms dictated by the state.
So how did they actually go about monitoring and controlling people? What were their main methods?
Well, they used a whole arsenal of tools and tactics, some quite sophisticated for the time, others more brutal and direct. Tapping phone lines was, of course, standard practice. They had thousands of technicians working around the clock, listening in on private conversations, looking for any hint of dissent or potential subversion.
And it wasn't just phones. They bugged homes, offices, even public spaces. They had hidden cameras and microphones everywhere, capturing people's every move.
And then, of course, there was the constant pressure from this vast network of informers who could report on anything from casual conversations to suspected political activities or even just personal habits that might deviate from the socialist ideal.
It was a truly Orwellian system, designed to create a society where privacy was essentially non-existent, where any sense of individuality or freedom of thought was systematically crushed under the weight of constant surveillance.
And all of this massive and incredibly expensive apparatus of repression, was ultimately geared towards one primary goal: maintaining the absolute power of the ruling Communist Party, the Socialist Unity Party of Germany, or SED.
Right. They were obsessed with preventing any potential challenge to their authority, any form of dissent that might threaten their grip on power.
And one of their biggest fears, maybe their biggest fear, was the constant drain of people fleeing to the West.
The so-called brain drain, as it was sometimes called, where skilled workers, intellectuals, artists, anyone seeking greater freedom and opportunity would risk everything to escape to West Germany.
Precisely. East Germany, despite its official pronouncements of a thriving socialist workers' paradise, simply couldn't compete with the economic prosperity and personal liberties offered in the West.
So they built the Berlin Wall in 1961, this incredibly visible and brutal symbol of division, to physically prevent people from leaving.
But the wall, while physically effective, wasn't enough. They needed the Stasi to control people's minds, to eliminate any desire to escape, to make them believe that there was no alternative to life under their rule.
So the wall was the physical manifestation of their control, and the Stasi was the psychological arm, working tirelessly to create a society of obedient and unquestioning citizens.
What's particularly striking is how these two forms of control, the physical and the psychological, constantly reinforced each other.
Right. The wall served as this constant reminder of the lack of freedom, the consequences of even thinking about escape. And the Stasi's presence, always felt but rarely seen, ensured that any thought of resistance, any yearning for something better, would be swiftly crushed.
It's a truly chilling example of a totalitarian state using every means at its disposal to maintain absolute control over its population.
Now let's bring this down to a more personal level. You shared some incredibly powerful stories about individuals who lived through this period, who experienced the Stasi's control firsthand.
Absolutely. And each of these stories offers us a unique perspective on how this system of repression actually played out in people's daily lives, the very real human cost of this kind of absolute control.
One story that really stuck with me was that of Miriam Weber. She was born in 1952, just a few years after the end of World War II, and grew up in Leipzig, a major city in East Germany.
Miriam's story is particularly fascinating because it takes us through several distinct phases of East German history, from the initial post-war period of rebuilding and the establishment of the communist state, to the construction of the Berlin Wall and the growing disillusionment among many young people, and finally to the tumultuous events of 1989 that led to the fall of the wall and the collapse of the regime.
As a child, Miriam, like many others of her generation, genuinely believed in the core communist ideals, the promises of equality, free education, guaranteed jobs, and a society where everyone's needs were met.
Right. It's important to remember that for many people, especially those who had experienced the horrors of war and the economic chaos that followed, these ideals held genuine appeal. The Communist Party presented itself as the only viable path towards a more just and equitable society.
And the government was incredibly effective at promoting this narrative. Through schools, the state-controlled media, even through youth organizations and cultural events, they constantly reinforced this message of a socialist utopia in the making.
They were masters of propaganda, skillfully manipulating information and shaping public perception to legitimize their rule and demonize the West.
And for a while, it seemed to work. Miriam herself recalled feeling a genuine sense of pride in being part of this new socialist nation, this grand experiment in social engineering that was supposed to create a better world for everyone.
But as she grew older and began to experience more of the world around her, she started to notice a growing disconnect between the official narrative and the reality of life in East Germany.
One key turning point for her was the construction of the Berlin Wall in 1961. Miriam was only 11 years old at the time, but she vividly remembers the shock and confusion of seeing her city suddenly divided, families and friends separated by this imposing barrier of concrete and barbed wire.
The official explanation, of course, was that the wall was necessary to protect East Germany from Western aggression, to prevent fascists and spies from infiltrating their socialist paradise.
But even as a child, Miriam instinctively knew that something wasn't right. Why would they need a wall to keep people in if their system was so great? Why were so many people risking their lives to escape to the West?
The wall, despite all the propaganda surrounding it, became this incredibly potent symbol of the regime's insecurity, their deep-seated fear of their own people.
And for Miriam, it planted the seeds of doubt that would continue to grow as she got older.
Then, in 1968, when Miriam was just 16, she witnessed another event that would deeply shake her faith in the system: the brutal suppression of protests in Leipzig.
These protests, sparked by the Soviet invasion of Czechoslovakia, were relatively small in scale but deeply significant in their message. People were demanding greater freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, basic human rights that were being denied by the East German regime.
The government's response was swift and merciless. They deployed riot police, used water cannons and tear gas against unarmed demonstrators, and arrested hundreds of people.
Miriam, who was at the protests with a friend, was horrified by what she saw. It was a stark and brutal awakening to the true nature of the regime she lived under, a regime that was clearly willing to use violence and intimidation to silence any form of dissent.
And this experience, witnessing the state's violent crackdown on peaceful protesters, really ignited Miriam's sense of injustice, her own desire to resist.
So she and her friend Ursula decided to take action, a seemingly small but deeply significant act of defiance in the context of this oppressive system.
They decided to create simple leaflets with the message, "Consultation, not fire hoses," a direct and powerful rebuke of the government's violent response to the protests.
But here's where you really see the suffocating nature of the regime, the incredible lengths they went to control even the most basic forms of expression.
Miriam and Ursula couldn't just print their leaflets. They didn't have access to a printing press or even a typewriter. Those things were strictly controlled by the state.
So they had to improvise, using a children's rubber stamp set to painstakingly create their message, letter by letter, on small pieces of paper.
It's a really poignant detail, this image of two teenagers filled with a sense of righteous anger and a desire to speak truth to power, forced to use a child's toy to make their voices heard.
And their message, while simple, was incredibly powerful in its directness. It cut through all the propaganda, all the justifications for repression, and exposed the raw brutality of the regime.
And of course, this act of defiance, however small it might seem to us now, was not going to go unnoticed by the Stasi.
Their fateful mistake, the action that set off a chain of events that would change Miriam's life forever, was posting some of these leaflets in the mailbox of a classmate.
They thought they were being clever, targeting someone they thought might be sympathetic to their cause.
But they had underestimated the reach of the Stasi and the pervasive atmosphere of fear and suspicion they had created.
The classmates' parents, horrified by what they saw as potential act of subversion, immediately reported the incident to the authorities.
And within hours, the Stasi was at Miriam's school, launching a full-blown investigation to identify and punish those responsible for this act of sedition.
Sedition was a very serious charge in East Germany, carrying a potential prison sentence of several years.
Miriam and Ursula, now realizing the gravity of the situation, made a pact to keep silent, to protect each other from the Stasi's interrogation.
But the Stasi was incredibly skilled at breaking people down, at using psychological pressure and manipulation to extract confessions.
And they were relentless in their pursuit of information. They interviewed teachers, classmates, neighbors, anyone who might have even the slightest connection to Miriam and Ursula.
And it wasn't long before they found their evidence, a seemingly minor but ultimately damning detail that would seal Miriam's fate.
During a search of Miriam's family home, they discovered a few stray rubber letters from the stamp set she had used to create the leaflets.
Miriam, thinking she had safely discarded them, was horrified. It was a direct link to her involvement in the leaflet campaign.
And despite her initial denials, the Stasi, with their years of experience in extracting confessions, were able to break her down.
They used a combination of psychological pressure, sleep deprivation, and even threats against her family to force her to confess.
Miriam, exhausted and terrified, eventually signed a prepared confession, admitting to her involvement in the seditious leaflet campaign.
And that confession, coerced under duress, would have serious consequences for her future.
She was released from custody just before Christmas, but the threat of a trial and a potential prison sentence loomed over her.
And Miriam, now fully aware of the brutality of the regime she lived under, made a desperate and incredibly risky decision.
She decided to try and escape to West Berlin, to cross the heavily guarded Berlin Wall, knowing that if she was caught, the consequences would be dire.
It was a decision born out of desperation, a young woman feeling trapped and hopeless, willing to risk everything for a chance at freedom.
It's New Year's Eve, 1969, and Miriam finds herself in divided Berlin for the first time since the wall went up.
The wall itself was an imposing sight, a concrete barrier topped with barbed wire stretching for miles through the heart of the city.
And between the two walls, there was the infamous Death Strip, a heavily guarded no-man's land patrolled by armed guards and attack dogs.
It was a chilling reminder of the lengths to which the regime was willing to go to prevent its citizens from escaping.
Miriam, determined to find a way through, spent hours walking along the wall looking for any weakness, any opportunity.
But the wall was heavily fortified with watchtowers, searchlights, and tripwires, all designed to deter even the most determined escapee.
After hours of searching, feeling utterly defeated and exhausted, Miriam made the heartbreaking decision to return to Leipzig to face whatever fate awaited her there.
It must have been a crushing moment, realizing that escape was seemingly impossible, that she was trapped within this oppressive system.
But as fate would have it, as she was riding the train back to Leipzig, she noticed something unusual.
As they were crossing the Bornholmer Bridge, Miriam saw a section of the wall that was different from the rest.
Instead of the imposing concrete barrier, this section was simply a tall wire fence, seemingly less heavily guarded.
And in that moment, a spark of hope rekindled within Miriam. Maybe, just maybe, this was her chance.
Without hesitation, she grabbed a discarded ladder from a nearby construction site and quickly scaled the fence, dropping down into the death strip.
It was an incredibly risky move, a spur-of-the-moment decision driven by desperation and a sliver of hope.
Miraculously, she managed to avoid the tripwires and the searchlights, even encountering a guard dog that for some reason didn't bark.
She was incredibly lucky. A slight misstep, a moment of bad timing, and she would have been caught.
Reaching the second fence, she could see the lights of West Berlin. Freedom, tantalizingly close.
But then disaster struck. As she was climbing the final fence, her foot snagged a hidden tripwire.
Instantly, sirens blared, floodlights illuminated the area, and armed guards surrounded her.
Her escape attempt, so close to success, had ended in a cruel and heartbreaking capture.
The guards were brutal, kicking and punching her as they dragged her away.
They hurled insults at her, calling her a traitor and a criminal.
She was taken to a Stasi prison in Leipzig, where she was subjected to days of intense interrogation, sleep deprivation, and psychological torture.
The interrogators wanted to know everything about her escape attempt, who had helped her, what her motivations were.
Miriam, exhausted and delirious, eventually invented a story about a fictitious resistance group that had aided her escape.
She knew it was a lie, but she was desperate to stop the torture.
But the lie backfired. When the Stasi discovered her fabrication, they punished her even more severely.
They extended her prison sentence to 2 years, a harsh punishment for a teenage girl who had simply dared to dream of freedom.
The conditions in the prison were appalling. Overcrowded cells, meager food rations, constant harassment from the guards.
It was a place designed to break people's spirits, to punish them for daring to challenge the authority of the state.
Now let's turn to another story, one that highlights a different aspect of the Stasi's control, a more insidious and subtle form of oppression.
The story of Julia Berend, born in 1966, shows us how the Stasi's reach extended far beyond overt acts of dissent, how they could manipulate and control people's lives, even without resorting to direct violence or imprisonment.
Julia grew up in a family that, like many others in East Germany, had learned to avoid anything that might attract the attention of the Stasi.
They didn't discuss politics, they didn't criticize the government, they tried to blend in to be model citizens.
There's a form of self-censorship that became deeply ingrained in many families, a way to protect themselves from the unpredictable and often arbitrary actions of the state.
Julia's parents, both teachers, were particularly careful to avoid any form of political activity. They had seen firsthand how even the slightest hint of dissent could lead to repercussions, loss of jobs, social ostracism, even imprisonment.
So they raised Julia to be cautious, to follow the rules, to avoid standing out in any way.
And for a while, it seemed like this strategy was working. Julia was a bright and ambitious student, excelling in her studies and hoping to attend university.
But then, in her late teens, she met a young man from Italy at the Leipzig Trade Fair, one of the few events that allowed limited contact between East Germans and foreigners.
They began a long-distance relationship, exchanging letters and occasional visits, a seemingly innocent connection that would soon draw the unwelcome attention of the Stasi.
The Stasi, ever vigilant for any potential threat to the regime, viewed relationships with foreigners with extreme suspicion.
They saw such relationships as potential avenues for espionage, for spreading subversive ideas, or even for facilitating escape attempts.
So they began monitoring Julia's relationship, intercepting her letters, tapping her phone calls, even following her and her boyfriend when he visited East Germany. Julia and her boyfriend started noticing these subtle signs of surveillance. Letters arriving torn and retaped, unexplained encounters with police officers, a constant feeling of being watched.
And it wasn't just their actions that were being monitored. The Stasi was also interested in their thoughts, their conversations, their hopes and dreams.
They wanted to know everything about Julia and her boyfriend, to assess whether they posed a threat to the state.
Julia's parents, terrified of the potential consequences, urged her to end the relationship, to avoid further scrutiny from the Stasi.
They had seen firsthand how the Stasi could ruin lives, and they didn't want their daughter to become another victim of their relentless pursuit of control.
But Julia, deeply in love and unwilling to give up her relationship, refused to listen to her parents' warnings.
And this defiance, this refusal to conform to the state's expectations, would have serious consequences for her future.
As Julia neared the end of high school, she set her sights on attending university, hoping to pursue a career as a translator.
She had excellent grades in all subjects, but there was one crucial hurdle she had to overcome: the mandatory civics exam, a test of political knowledge and loyalty to the socialist state.
This exam was essentially a litmus test for ideological conformity, a way for the state to weed out anyone deemed insufficiently loyal to the regime.
And despite her academic achievements, Julia failed the civics exam, a result that shocked both her and her teachers.
It quickly became apparent that the Stasi had intervened, manipulating the exam results to punish Julia for her relationship with the Italian man.
They saw her as a potential defector, someone who might eventually choose to leave East Germany and live in the West.
So they used their power to block her path to higher education, to limit her opportunities, to punish her for her perceived disloyalty.
The headmaster of her school, a party loyalist, confirmed these suspicions during a chilling visit to Julia's parents.
He told them in no uncertain terms that Julia had been placed on a blacklist by the Stasi and that she would never be allowed to pass the civics exam, no matter how well she performed.
Her future, once so bright and promising, had been deliberately sabotaged by the state, all because of a personal relationship they deemed a threat to their control.
It's a heartbreaking example of how the Stasi could reach into even the most seemingly apolitical aspects of people's lives, using their power to manipulate and control outcomes, to enforce conformity, and punish even the slightest hint of defiance.
Over the next several years, Julia faced a series of setbacks and frustrations, each one seemingly orchestrated by the unseen hand of the Stasi.
She applied for numerous jobs, always a perfect candidate on paper, but was inexplicably rejected time and time again.
Potential employers, fearful of hiring someone blacklisted by the Stasi, wouldn't dare offer her a position.
It was a subtle but effective form of social control, a way to punish dissenters without resorting to overt violence or imprisonment.
Julia, feeling trapped and hopeless, eventually made the painful decision to break up with her Italian boyfriend, hoping that by severing ties with the West, she might somehow regain favor with the authorities.
It was a desperate and heartbreaking sacrifice, a young woman forced to choose between love and a chance at a normal life.
But even after ending the relationship, the Stasi's grip on her life didn't loosen. They had made their point, demonstrated their power, and Julia remained a marked woman.
She was isolated, unemployed, living under a cloud of suspicion, her future uncertain and bleak.
Then one day, she received an official summons to report to a specific room at the local police station.
Room 118, a place known to be used by the Stasi for interrogations.
The summons filled Julia with dread. She knew what it meant. The Stasi, after years of monitoring her from the shadows, had finally decided to bring her in for a face-to-face encounter.
The officer who greeted her was polite but chillingly matter-of-fact.
He laid out a file on his desk filled with details about Julia's life, photocopies of her letters, transcripts of her phone calls, even information about her family and friends.
It was a calculated display of power, a way to show Julia that they knew everything about her, that she had no secrets, no privacy.
Then came the proposition. The officer, speaking in a calm and almost friendly tone, offered Julia a way out of her predicament.
If she agreed to become an informer for the Stasi, to report on her friends, her acquaintances, anyone they deemed a potential threat to the state, the black mark against her name would be erased.
She would be able to find a job, to attend university, to resume a normal life.
It was a tempting offer, a chance to escape the stifling control that had dominated her life for so long.
But Julia, to her immense credit, refused. She couldn't bring herself to betray the trust of those around her, to become a cog in the machine of repression that had caused her so much pain.
It was a brave and principled decision, a refusal to compromise her values even when faced with such a difficult choice.
But her refusal came at a price. The Stasi, angered by her defiance, made sure that her life remained difficult. She continued to face obstacles in finding work, her movements were restricted, and she lived under a constant cloud of suspicion.
Julia's story is a powerful example of the Stasi's more insidious methods of control, their ability to manipulate and punish people without resorting to overt violence or imprisonment.
They could make your life a living hell, not by throwing you in jail, but by systematically blocking your opportunities, isolating you from society, and making you constantly question your own worth.
And as we'll see, this kind of psychological pressure could be just as damaging, just as long-lasting as physical imprisonment.
Now let's shift gears a bit and talk about the eventual downfall of the Stasi, a a story that is both dramatic and unexpected.
For decades, the Stasi seemed invincible, an all-seeing, all-knowing force that controlled every aspect of life in East Germany.
But by the late 1980s, cracks began to appear in the facade of communist control, not just in East Germany, but across the entire Soviet bloc.
The Soviet economy was stagnating, political reforms in Moscow were creating ripples of dissent throughout Eastern Europe, and the Berlin Wall, once a symbol of communist power, was becoming increasingly unsustainable.
The East German government, led by the aging and increasingly out-of-touch Erich Honecker, seemed oblivious to the gathering storm.
They clung to the old ways, relying on the Stasi to maintain control, even as the tide of history was turning against them.
In a desperate attempt to stave off collapse, the Stasi developed an elaborate plan, codenamed Day X, which outlined the mass arrest of tens of thousands of suspected dissidents.
The plan, if implemented, would have resulted in one of the largest waves of political repression in East German history.
But events were moving too fast for the Stasi to maintain control.
In the autumn of 1989, mass protests erupted across East Germany, inspired by similar demonstrations in other communist countries.
People, emboldened by the winds of change sweeping across Europe, took to the streets demanding freedom, democracy, and an end to Stasi repression.
The Monday demonstrations in Leipzig, where tens of thousands of people marched peacefully through the city center, became a focal point for the growing resistance movement.
The authorities, initially hesitant to use force against such large crowds, eventually cracked down, but the repression only fueled the protests.
It became clear that the regime was losing its grip on power, that the people were no longer willing to live under the yoke of Stasi control.
Then, in a moment that would change the course of history, the East German government, under immense pressure from both internal and external forces, announced a relaxation of travel restrictions to the West.
It was a seemingly minor concession, but it had unintended and far-reaching consequences.
People, hearing the news, interpreted it as the opening of the border, and thousands upon thousands of East Germans rushed to the Berlin Wall, demanding to be let through.
The border guards, overwhelmed and confused, eventually relented, opening the gates and allowing people to cross freely into West Berlin for the first time in decades.
The fall of the Berlin Wall was a moment of joyous celebration, a testament to the power of people power, and a resounding defeat for the Stasi and the regime they had served for so long.
It was a truly historic moment, a symbolic end to the Cold War division of Europe, and a victory for freedom and democracy.
In the immediate aftermath of the wall's collapse, the Stasi headquarters in Berlin and other cities were stormed by crowds of citizens determined to secure the archives and prevent the destruction of evidence of the regime's crimes.
These brave individuals, risking their own safety, ensured that the Stasi's legacy of repression would not be forgotten, that the victims of their surveillance and persecution would have a chance to uncover the truth about what had happened to them.
And that brings us back to Miriam, who, after years of fighting for justice, finally had the opportunity to confront the ghosts of her past.
With the fall of the wall, the Stasi's vast archives were open to the public, and millions of people, including Miriam, were able to request access to their files.
Miriam, still haunted by the mysterious circumstances surrounding her husband's death in Stasi custody, was determined to uncover the truth, to find out what had really happened to Charlie.
But the task was daunting. The Stasi had shredded millions of pages of documents in a desperate attempt to cover up their crimes.
It was a massive and painstaking process, but Miriam, with the help of dedicated archivists and researchers, was able to piece together fragments of information to slowly reconstruct the events leading up to Charlie's death.
And what she discovered was both heartbreaking and infuriating. The files revealed that Charlie had been subjected to intense interrogation and psychological pressure, that his death was likely not a suicide, but a deliberate act of murder by the Stasi.
The truth, so long suppressed, had finally come to light, but it came too late for Charlie and for countless others who had suffered at the hands of the Stasi.
Miriam's story, like so many others from this period, reminds us of the enduring human cost of totalitarianism, the scars it leaves on individuals, families, and entire societies.
It also highlights the incredible resilience of the human spirit, the courage to resist even in the face of overwhelming odds, and the determination to seek justice no matter how long it takes.
The story of the Stasi is a cautionary tale, a reminder of what can happen when power goes unchecked, when surveillance becomes all-encompassing, and when dissent is ruthlessly crushed.
It's a story that is both deeply disturbing and incredibly relevant to our world today, where technology is constantly pushing the boundaries of what can be monitored and controlled.
And it's a story that forces us to confront some very difficult questions about the nature of freedom, the limits of privacy, and the responsibility we all have to safeguard the rights of individuals against the encroachment of state power.
So as we wrap up this deep dive into the world of the Stasi, I want to leave you with a final thought, something to ponder as you go about your day.
In an age of increasingly sophisticated surveillance technologies, where governments and corporations are collecting vast amounts of data about our lives, where the lines between privacy and security are constantly being blurred, what lessons can we learn from the Stasi's legacy of repression?
What steps can we take, individually and collectively, to ensure that we don't repeat the mistakes of the past? That we safeguard the fundamental freedoms that were so brutally denied to the people of East Germany?
It's a crucial question, one that we all need to grapple with as we navigate this increasingly complex and interconnected world.
And on that note, we'll leave you to continue the conversation. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive into the chilling world of the Stasi.